It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, of course, as always from the flight deck. And that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, very pleased to have as our guest, Kyle Schwartz. Who's Kyle Schwartz? He's a third grade teacher. That tells us a lot about her right there. She lives in Denver, Colorado. A work called I Wish My Teacher Knew, How One Question Can Change Everything for Our Kids. And she would know that as a third grade teacher when her I Wish My Teacher Knew tweet went viral in 2015. Her work was covered by all the major networks, USA Today, The Washington Post, Salon.com, and others. Should be an interesting discussion about children, our children, your children, her children. Kyle, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. Share with us a little bit how you got into teaching, why teaching is important to you, and why we need to think more, maybe, about those that teach our children.
Well, my story into the classroom is a little unlikely because I was one of those kids, and especially in elementary school, that just hated school, hated it, really struggled to connect with other students, struggled to connect with teachers. And, now looking back as an adult, I can see that kind of the genesis of that was a major shift my family made from a small farm town to a big, suburb to end all suburbs. So it was really difficult for me to navigate that divide, and it showed up in me having a very challenging relationship towards school. So when I was in college, I actually did a year of national service through City Year and the AmeriCorps program, and I started working in public schools in Washington, D.C., and I loved it. I loved working with kids. I connected so well with them, and I really was just inspired every day, but I also saw the realities and the inequities of our public education system, comparing what I had in my very well-resourced public school to what kids in Southeast D.C. had in terms of when they went to school. And that kind of lit a fire in me to really become a teacher, to serve kids, especially near my hometown in Denver, because I think that all kids deserve an excellent education, and the reality is right now that's not happening.
Right now, what do you think? And again, I know you are very enthusiastic, obviously, and very, very dedicated. But what are we missing? Why is there, in some ways, almost a laissez-faire or a blah attitude towards our public schools right now, do you think?
That is a good question. I would say my hope is that there's just a lot of ignorance to what's really happening, because I know in my school, when I was growing up in this well-resourced suburb, I had no idea what school was like for other kids. I teach now literally less than 20 minutes away from where I grew up, and where I teach now we have about 90% of kids living at or very near the poverty line. And so I had no idea that this other reality existed for students. So my hope is that it's not a situation of people know and don't care. I hope that it's a situation of we need to bring attention to the realities that students are facing in this country when they go to school. And one thing I talk about in the book is right now in America, more children live in poverty than don't. And I think if we really get real about that fact, then perhaps we'll be able to develop the political will to change it.
Got a question. The entire premise, I wish my teacher knew. Again, one of the things that I know, this is really, you see this as a book really for everybody, whether it's teachers, parents, communities in general, probably at some level students, all trying to understand really what motivates it. You divided the book into 8 different sections and trying to approach each child exactly, so to speak, where they are in life, and whether that regardless of their background, rich, poor, young, old, they come from a divorced family, separated family, blended family, etc. I'm curious as to are these questions somewhat where it says, I wish my teacher knew? Did you ask kids this question and get answers, or is this just something over time you've compiled on your own?
So where this all came from is, a very, very simple yet powerful lesson I did in my classroom, and I started it in my very first year of teaching. And all I did was I passed kids out little pieces of paper, and I wrote on the board, I wish my teacher knew, and I had them fill in the blank. And from that, I received messages like, some cute messages like, I wish my teacher knew how to play football, and I wish my teacher knew I want to go to college. But I also received some very poignant responses where students were able to kind of advocate for themselves. Like, I wish my teacher knew I don't have pencils at home to do my homework. I wish my teacher knew my mom's not around to sign my homework at night, to sign my reading log. I wish my teacher knew that there's this struggle that I'm having, and if my teacher knew it, maybe she could support me. So that's where the idea came out of. And I've done it in my classroom for years before. I just found one note at my house and took a picture and shared it, and it kind of went viral. But it's been a great exercise in, here's this one thing that worked in my classroom. Here's one thing where I found success, and I want to share it. And in sharing it, it's the power of this assignment has just been multiplied.
What I'm curious as to share with our Lewis at Large listeners, again, if you just joined us, Warner Lewis here from the Flight Deck, as you know. We're talking to Kyle Schwartz. He's a third grade teacher in Denver, Colorado, but really, and this is not to lessen her importance, it's actually to raise her importance. She could be anywhere USA, I believe. A really interesting new work called I Wish My Teacher Knew, a subtitle, How One Question Can Change Everything for Our Kids. Kyle, I'm curious to share with us, if you would, some answers that made you feel very, very hopeful, and then on the other side, maybe some that made you feel a little forlorn a little bit.
Well, certainly in the school that I teach in, there are very real economic barriers, and in most places in America, there's extreme isolation of racial and economic status. And so sometimes that plays into the notes. But then there's also universal struggles that all kids have. And so I had an experience once where, a kid shared, I wish my teacher knew I don't have a friend to play with me. And, just the simplicity of that statement and the truth of that statement, it's really heart-wrenching to know that a kid is feeling so isolated. And one thing I talk about in the book, and that the lesson has evolved in my classroom, is that the kids started asking if they could share their notes out and read them to each other. And I allowed for that. And when she shared, I wish my teacher knew I don't have a friend to play with me, all the kids really rallied around her, and they got it because they've all felt that way too. And so they were able to use their empathy and support her. And, she then had kids going up to her at recess, sitting next to her at lunch. And I think that's been a really powerful example of how these notes have not only just informed me as a teacher, but also been a powerful way to create community.
What about one of the things that I noticed in here was some students that written in that some had talked about even contemplating suicide or doing something harmful to themselves, and they wish their teacher knew. What kind of reaction did that instill in you, and what, I suppose, are you allowed by law or whatever regulations in which you have to conform to, are you allowed to help them or to reach out to them?
Well, just to be clear, so I've had many responses in my classroom to notes, and the notes that I share are from kids from all across America in the book. And so I really have not had an instance through the notes in which I needed to take, action to protect a kid, although I've done that many, many times in my classroom through other avenues. But teachers, and maybe people don't know this, teachers are mandatory reporters, as are most people who work with children. So if we have a authentic concern for a child, we are legally obligated to report that to a child protection agency. And that's something that I've done that every teacher I know has done many times, because kids really can reach out to, when kids can reach out to their teacher and share that, there's a very real danger that they're experiencing or a very real fear. Teachers are often the people who hear that and are able to take action. And one thing maybe people don't know, teachers are the number one profession a group of people who actually report about child abuse or neglect. So teachers, in addition to all of our academic responsibilities, we serve a very, very important role for our children in every city in the country.
What, as you read these things and as you continue to read them and compile them, what different perspective, or how does that change your view of your own students? This is because just this very simple question seems extraordinarily revealing to me.
How does it change the view of my students? I would say, many people have kind of asked me, like, were you surprised that your kids said that they were struggling with this? Or were you surprised that your kids said that they didn't have this at home? And I would say I was not at all naive to the challenges that my students are facing. But it was really interesting for me to see when I gave them the opportunity to say anything they wanted to me, what they actually chose to say. So, even a student whom, I knew that she had experienced her father's deportation and she had already told me about it. When I asked her the one thing to tell me, that's what came to mind. And then it was still so salient and poignant for her even years later. And so that was really a learning for me that, when you pay attention to not only what kids say, but what they're choosing to say, that's really important. But I also what surprised me the most was when my students kind of asked me if they could share them with the class. And what really surprised me was how perfectly capable kids are to support each other. Like the example I gave with the student who said, I don't have a friend to play with me. But also, I had a student in my classroom who was experiencing her parents' divorce, but did not know that that is something that happens to other people too. Did not know that, other kids had gone through that, other kids that she'd sat next to all year. And so, it really surprised me how able kids were to show empathy, how able they were to be vulnerable, and how able they were to create a community and a support system for each other.
Kyle, how often do you do this exercise with your students?
Well, I do it about once a year, but I do state in the book, and I give a detailed classroom guide for people who would like to try this exercise in their classroom. I do it about once a year, but I say repeat when needed. I think that if you just have a feeling in your classroom, you have the sense that there's something that needs to be said, or that you maybe have a conundrum about why a student is acting that way, maybe try this out. Try it out again. Maybe if there's an incident that impacts the whole school community, like perhaps a death that has impacted the school community, or an issue of safety and security, invite students to share with you what their truth is. And I have found that in many cases they do. I also like to say I make this activity completely optional for students. So they're able to, go from writing it and sharing it out loud to the class to not participating at all. This is something that they can choose to do or choose not to do, and both of those options are fine.
Are you, again, you touched on this earlier, but share with us, our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, to the extent that you'd know, are other teachers now doing this same exercise?
Well, that has been something that really shocked me. This has gone so far, and I am thrilled. My students are thrilled that their voices have reached so far, but I literally have gotten, people are connecting with me on Twitter and using the hashtag I wish my teacher knew. So I'm finding out about people using this exercise in all corners of the globe. I just got a message from a teacher in Afghanistan. I just read an article about a teacher in rural Iran who did this exercise, found out that his students were coming to school hungry, and started a meal program for them. I've gotten messages from people who are using this exercise with students in refugee camps, Syrian refugees in Greece. And that to me is shocking that it's gone so far. This little thing in my classroom has gone so far, but I think it speaks to the universal desire for teachers and students to build relationships, and that crosses all cultural boundaries.
What about, has this changed your view of what your role as a teacher is, should be, or tell us a little bit about that from your perspective?
Well, I know for myself, and truly most teachers I know, we view our role not only as building academic skills, and we do view that role very seriously. We are building academic skills, but we are also in a nurturing role with students in which we are supporting them in their child development. And so often that means, not only just addressing academic concepts and making sure they can come up with the right answer, but it's also addressing their critical thinking skills. Building character is something I talk about in the book, and I don't think it's at all a new concept in education that's been titled character education, but I think that it is very important that we are deliberate about building values in our students. So, you can't learn complex concepts without perseverance. So we need to address perseverance and determination in our students. But also, I think this angle that people may not have realized is that we need to build empathy and compassion in our children because it is an academic skill. And by that I mean that you cannot read literature and understand it if you do not have the ability to empathize with characters, if you don't have the ability to understand motivation and human dynamics. So I think that, there's more attention being paid to this idea of building children and addressing childhood development beyond just academics.
You just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Kyle Schwartz. She is a third grade teacher in the Denver, Colorado area. A brand new work called I Wish My Teacher Knew, How One Question Can Change Everything for Kids. This is an extraordinary collection of ideas, an extraordinary collection of responses to this question that she has received from students, and some observations, obviously, from her as well. Kyle, do you think, again, you're teaching third graders, but I'm curious as to what the answers might be from a junior high kid or a college kid or a high school kid. What about that?
Well, I have heard from, certainly junior high and high school teachers. I've also heard from, at the college level, people doing I Wish My Professor Knew. And even beyond that, this has been such a shock to me, but people are kind of using the same spirit of this lesson in multiple settings. So I've had social workers tell me they're doing I Wish My Foster Parents Knew with kids that they serve, or therapists tell me they're doing I Wish My Counselor Knew. And kind of the craziest one is I was actually reached out to by the Vice Admiral of the U.S. Coast Guard, and he did I Wish My Admiral Knew with his troops. So I think that, again, it's this universal thing that if we're going to build relationships, there are things that need to become clear. There are things that need to become known. And so if we're brave enough to ask what those things are, the other person in the relationship might be willing to answer us and be honest. And, it's about asking so that someone else can answer, but also listening so someone else can be heard.
At what point, Kyle, in your opinion, does the role of the teacher and the role of the public schools stop in terms of parenting or being involved in the quality of life for the child outside the classroom?
I think, it is definitely a gray area and a blurry line. I am not parenting the students in my classroom. I'm not it's not that I have a Sunday school or a community service program going on in my classroom. It is very much a classroom, and we are, very much have academic pursuits in mind. But I think I think the question is less of where does the line stop and how can we build a collaboration between both of these sides? How can we get teachers and schools to fully collaborate with families and communities? Because, it takes a village to educate a child. So if we have, our families and our communities, and our teachers and our schools, if our interests are fully aligned, if there's open and clear communication, if everyone's supporting each other, we know that that's best for kids.
Kyle, what about now that you've written this one, what's your plan for the future besides teaching? Because I know you're dedicated to doing that.
Well, my plan for the future is teachers are heading back to school on Monday, so summer's over for me, and I am very much dedicated to being a teacher. I'm going back to my third grade classroom. And my next professional goal is to become a board-certified teacher, which people probably don't know about, but it's like another level of professional development that a teacher can obtain through this rigorous program of board certification, national board certification. And I hope that kind of illuminates for people that teachers are very much professionals, and we very much have a professional practice. And so we are always trying to improve, to reflect, and grow, and that's just what I want to continue doing.
Well, the name of the work, again, is called I Wish My Teacher Knew, How One Question Can Change Everything for Our Kids, done by, beautifully done, and an extraordinary collection of responses and ideas from those responses by Kyle Schwartz, again, third grade teacher in the Denver, Colorado area. It's published by Lifelong Books. Kyle, how can people find out more? Maybe grab a copy of the book and find out a little bit more about what you do.
Well, the book, I'm so excited, is available, like everywhere books are sold, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and your local independent bookseller. But I would love to connect with people on, social media by using the hashtag I Wish My Teacher Knew, or people can find me on Twitter at, my handle is at Kyle M. Schwartz. And so I would love to connect with people and hear what's going on in their classrooms, because this one little idea that I had in my classroom has gone so far, and I know that there are so many other things that teachers are doing that if they shared, they could really help and support other people.
Well, we appreciate your time today and your insights. Thank you for your work with America's children and sharing these extraordinary thoughts with us, and would love to have you on again sometime.
Oh, thank you. I would love that.
Well, indeed. Have a wonderful year teaching school, and we will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.